So you'll see I have contact information on the first page. I do most of my sort of intellectual social media work on Twitter, and I love being in conversation with teachers. I always learn a lot from you and your perspective about bringing history to classrooms. So please do join me in historical conversations on there. I also, for better or for worse, am the only Zara Anishanslin in the entire world. And so I'm very easy to find. And if you have follow-up questions, I'm more than happy to be in touch via email with you. So today's lecture could, of course, cover pretty much everything. We were sort of joking, we were discussing what we were going to do, that this could be the everything but the kitchen sink lecture, perhaps even the everything and the kitchen sink lecture. And there were so many different ways that I could have gone with this. And what I decided to do was to think about what doesn't get as much attention in the other very rich lectures that you have that focus on politics, on the law, on finance, all of which, for very understandable reasons, are dominated by white and mostly white elite men. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I could perhaps address that gets left out otherwise, the kitchen sink, if you will, is the people who weren't those elite white men. And so in this case, I'm thinking primarily of women and of Black Americans, both enslaved and free, and not so much Native Americans, Indians, because in the founding era, in the founding documents, they are not included in large part because most of them did not want to be included. Themselves as sovereign nations and had no part in the debates about citizenship that were going on during the founding period. So I'm not leaving them out of the story because I think they're unimportant. By contrast, I think they're extraordinarily important, but in terms of the founding documents that I'm going to pivot my discussion of American society around, they're not really part of the definition of what's going on with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and subsequent founding documents. So the bulk of this lecture, just to give you some chronology, is going to focus on the all-important 1790s, which I think is one of the most fascinating time periods in American history, not least because, as Denver explored with you yesterday, the wild and crazy partisanship of the 1790s is really something extraordinary. And although I'm going to focus on the 1790s and take us up to 1805 for a bit, and then to 1812. And then in the primary source discussion, of course, we're going to go into the antebellum period. But the bulk of what I'm discussing today is the 1790s. We really have to go back to the Revolution, which is my very favorite time period. So I'm not doing this to cheat, I promise. So let's start with Thomas Jefferson, who you heard a lot about yesterday. So the famous, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. These wonderfully stirring, elegant lines, penned, of course, by a man who held other human beings in bondage. And this is a central dichotomy at the heart of the American experience, a central sort of origin story about America, right? This pivot between slavery and freedom. But what I want to focus on today is less that issue of equality, of whether or not the Declaration itself meets its promise. As historian Gordon Wood said, the radicalism of the American Revolution, right? How radical is it? In Wood's telling, the radicalism lies in its potential, right? So although all men are created equal, is the phrase used, that can be extrapolated and applied over the centuries to other Americans. So to women, to African Americans, and to others who are going to be included in this struggle for equality under the American system and society. And yet, with all due respect to Gordon Wood, if we look at the 1790s, we're reminded very forcefully that this radicalism, this unfulfilled promise, this inherent promise within the revolution is a long time coming, especially if you're talking about women and about African Americans, both enslaved and free. And so what I want to talk about today is not just the promise of the founding era for women and African Americans, but also the unfulfilled promise, and what this means for how we think about American society, how it resonates with us even today, to this point. So during the American Revolution, women and African Americans were deeply involved in the revolutionary experience. As Denver mentioned, some of you have probably seen me on the Revolution Roadshow, and have heard my lecture on women in the American Revolution. And so those of you who had know that I'm a big proponent of the fact that women contributed mightily to the war effort. Obviously, most of them didn't actually bear arms. People like Deborah Sampson are an exception, which is part of what makes them so interesting to us. But women were militant contributors. They did everything from mount the most successful private fundraising campaign in the war, to boycotting British goods. They were absolutely pivotal in that movement, and to being camp followers who kept the Continental Army going. Similarly, African Americans, most of whom, of course, and those of you would know this from Woody Holton's lecture, who attended the Revolution series for Humanities Texas, African Americans had a better chance at freedom if they absconded to the British side, if they self-emancipated away from the Americans, right? And that is not to say, though, that the minority of African Americans who chose to fight for the Patriots, a much smaller number than African Americans who self-emancipated and threw in their cause, threw in their lot with the cause of the British, the much smaller group who stayed and fought for the Americans were a small but mighty group. And not least, as Lindsay Chervinsky reminded us on Monday, small and mighty in part because they helped to convince George Washington of the heroism, of the, I think, basic humanity of African Americans because of their valor as soldiers in ways that he hadn't really, I think, had to think about them before. And so although women and African Americans as groups played pivotal roles in the American Revolution, they weren't exactly rewarded for their patriotism in the political system that was set up after the war was won. Both had little direct political influence, much less the right to vote, with the interesting exception of New Jersey, where women as well, with property, independent women, unmarried women, as well as some free Blacks, were allowed to vote from the 1790s till 1807-8, at which point they were sort of kicked out of their right for the vote because they tended to vote Federalist, and the Anti-Federalist wanted them out of there. Happy to answer questions about that later too. And then for women, despite some liberalization of divorce laws after the revolution, for the most part, they remained locked in the economic and legal system of coverture, in which women who were married were held quite literally to be covered by their husband, to be not able to retain property, not able to do much of anything legally and economically speaking. And this, of course, is the main push that Abigail Adams was making for her husband, John, when she wrote to him about her famous exhortation to remember the ladies. She wasn't asking for the suffrage or anything wildly radical like that. She was asking him to remember women in the legal structures, particularly related to economics, and the ability for women like her much abused sister to escape from abusive husbands. And that was something that happened for women after the revolution. In many states, divorce laws were liberalized, so it was much easier for women to get out of an abusive or an abandoned spousal situation. But for the most part, for women, substantively speaking, the revolution remained largely unfulfilled in its promise in terms of extending the self-evident natural rights touted in the Declaration to them. And even more debilitating, of course, to African Americans was the fact that despite the gradual string of emancipation, most of them gradual emancipation laws in the Northeast, and a little spate of individual manumissions in Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, inspired by revolutionary fervor. The years after the Revolutionary War ended really saw a clamping down of systems of enslavement in the South. And for most African Americans, regardless of whether or not they had supported the revolutionary patriot cause, in most places, African Americans remained enslaved. And so focusing on these people, on this sort of unfulfilled promise that the American Revolution had for women and African Americans in the founding era, I think is a really great way for us to understand that the American founding era was a time of both fantastic promise, but also great unfulfillment in terms of that promise. And we really have to start with the Constitution itself, which is another document, I would argue, left room for some improvement, for some promise to be fulfilled, but certainly didn't fulfill any promises for greater rights for women or African Americans within its pages. And I think that coming back to this really famous anecdote of Benjamin Franklin being asked on the last day of the Constitutional Convention, what sort of government have you given us? And he answered, a republic if you can keep it. Coming back to this anecdote offers us some insight. So as the oft-told story goes, he is approached outside of the Constitutional Convention, so outside of Independence, the Independent State House, as it's now called in Philadelphia, and he's asked, what kind of government is it? And he answers this, a republic if you can keep it. I want you to hold on to this story because some of you have seen me talk about this before, but this is the story that you've heard, right? This is the story that you're familiar with. It's been trotted out a lot of late this year, especially. Nancy Pelosi invoked it multiple times during the impeachment proceedings. Neil Gorsuch published a memoir recently with the title, Republic If You Can Keep It. It's all over the place. And I'd like to suggest that how this story has been mistold since the founding era explains a lot about the unfulfilled promise for people like women and African Americans, who I will argue are not really, are given implicit but not explicit rights as part of we the people. So who are we the people? What does that mean in the preamble to the Constitution? And I wanted to start by dissecting quite literally who we the people are defined to be soon after the Constitution is ratified in the 1790 census, in the first census that is done in the United States of America under the first Census Act. And here you see a page, the census return for South Carolina, which enumerates how things were laid out in that census. And if you and your students are interested in demographics, I can't recommend census work highly enough. It's absolutely fascinating, particularly if you go and look at how things like race and its construction shift over time, what is seen as wanting to be recorded, whether enslaved people are listed separately or subsumed under their white slaveholders, for example, is very revealing. And in the 20th century, when you get that far, things like are Mexican people classified as white or not, and that changes even from 10 years. For example, the classification of Mexican as white or not in the US Census. So this is the first one. This is 1790. And I think it's really worth dwelling on how the United States Census conceives of we the people, of the demographics of we the people. And it's very much focused on states of liberty, on age, and on sex. And so the different classifications are free white males 16 and over, free white males under 16, free white females, slaves, and all other free people, which in this 1790 definition would omit, as they called it, Indians not taxed. So Indians who are defined as wild in the parlance of the day, living in separate nations on their own land, not paying taxes to the United States of America. So in this case, the US population in the 1790 census is about 4 million people, slightly less. Of these 4 million people, almost 700,000 of them are enslaved. And by 1790, almost 94% of those enslaved people live south of the Mason-Dixon line because of the emancipation acts that are happening bit by bit across the Northeast. Although, as many of you likely know, just because an Emancipation Act is passed doesn't mean that people are freed. I think that this is particularly relevant maybe in Texas, right, where you're about to celebrate Juneteenth, but also thinking about the fact that in Pennsylvania, for example, where you have the 1780 Gradual Emancipation Act, because of the terms of that legislation, you have enslaved people in Pennsylvania as late as the 1820s. So just because the act happens does not by any means mean that that it's a done deal. So what I'm going to do today, though, rather than focus on the enslaved population in the founding era, because that deserves really its own lecture. And what I want to do here is focus on free Blacks as well as women in the early Republic in the 1790s. And free Blacks, of course, are a much smaller portion of the population in the United States in 1790. Only about 60,000 of African Americans are free at this point in time, and most of them are clustered in cities. So cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Richmond, Charleston, New Orleans, etc. And they have very vibrant communities set up. And I think one of the reasons I want to discuss free Blacks rather than enslaved today, and by free Blacks, I also mean self-emancipated Blacks, as I'm going to call Ona Judge, is because I think it's important when we're thinking about the unfulfilled as well as the fulfilled promise implicit within the founding era, within its promises of what we the people will achieve as an American society, to not think of African Americans as sort of caught in this destructible juggernaut, this structural juggernaut of enslavement. To remember that Black people have always pushed against that throughout American history, and that this is something that's very visible in the 1790s in Philadelphia, and that has some direct and important impact on really important and powerful people of the day, notably George Washington. So if I get back to Republic, if you can keep it, if we're thinking about the other part of this story, and again, some of you have heard me discuss this, what happens with Republic if you can keep it? So the actual story is that Benjamin Franklin, who's shown here, is not accosted by a nameless person outside of the Constitutional Convention. On the contrary, he is met by a woman, Elizabeth Willing Powell, who's a longtime friend of his, dear friend of George Washington, wife of the last colonial mayor of Philadelphia and the first mayor under the New Republic, someone who hosted political people of importance, French nobles, etc., throughout the Revolution as well as during the Constitutional Convention. And Benjamin Franklin was not accosted by her in the streets. He went to her house where he was going to have one of the many social events that she hosted there. And when he got there, and I'm sorry, she seems to have disappeared from the screen for some reason. He was asked by her, "What sort of government have you given us, a republic or a monarchy?" And he answered, "A republic if you can keep it." Now, we know this story originally because James McHenry, who was part of what Lindsay Travinci called George Washington's B-team cabinet, James McHenry, who was a member of the Constitutional Convention, recorded this in his memoirs that he kept during the convention. And he called her a lady remarkable for her understanding and wit, identified her as the other pivotal person within this story. When he later published accounts of this in some newspapers in the early 19th century for, I should note, speaking of yesterday's lecture, very partisan reasons. He, like Elizabeth Willing Powell, was a staunch Federalist, and he was trying to make a point about anti-Federalists getting carried away with this crazy democracy thing, and that a republic was the way to go. And Benjamin Franklin and Mrs. Powell, a lady remarkable for her understanding and wit, had understood this in their exchange. So this story gets trotted out throughout the 19th century. Elizabeth Willing Powell, when it comes to her attention, because it's in the papers, says that she really can't be bothered to remember what happened with this because, as she put it, the all-important subject, meaning the Constitution, was frequently discussed at our house. Now, this raises some questions about the confidentiality issue of discussions around the Constitution, but this, I think, is a really telling note here that she's dropped for us, that so many people come to discuss politics at her house in the 1780s that she just can't be bothered to remember what it was. Now, what's interesting about this is that in subsequent tellings, James McHenry was very careful to keep Mrs. Powell at the center of the story. But in subsequent tellings, she's either completely dropped, as she was by Pelosi and Gorsuch, or she is sorely misrepresented, as she is here in one of the more recent books, relying on the anecdote for its title. And the reason I think this is important is that I think it speaks to two issues. The first is that the fact that her identity and the place of the happening, the place where the moment of exchange occurs, is sort of dropped out, is very, very telling, because it shows us that women are being taken out of the public sphere of politics, that they are being removed from the sphere in which they did have some political agency, namely their private homes and sociable spaces, and they have been sort of taken out into the streets, where they don't have the same political power that they can exert in their domestic settings. There's a reason that things like Republican motherhood as a concept are taken up by women as well as men. It's a way for them to exercise their rights within the polity, outside of things like suffrage that most propertied men are allowed to enjoy. So I also want to suggest that the other reason this is important, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of the lecture, is that it really speaks to how women have been written out of the founding era in general, and that this is not something that only women are sort of effaced from our collective memory, that in some cases African Americans have been erased from our memory of the founding era as well. And I'd like to suggest that we're still dealing with both of these issues, and that in a sense, whether or not we can keep the Republic, I think relies upon the stories we tell and why we choose to tell them. So one of the reasons that I think that writing Mrs. Powell's house out of the story, the setting of a republic if you can keep it, is important, is because, as Lindsay told us on Monday, how politics were decided in the early republic in the 1790s was very much being made up as we went along, right? That George Washington had to figure out how to make this presidency work, how to walk that fine line between being impressive and formidable, but not being aristocratic or monarchical. And one of the things that's pivotal here is the role of women in negotiating this sociable experience that underpinned the political one. In this case, what 19th century people called the Republican court. And this is the idea that the things like the levees that Washington held and the drawing room gatherings, the heterosocial drawing room gatherings that Martha Washington presided over, created this Republican court in which sociable exchange underpinned the political mechanics of the young republic. And in this case, I think it's really important to recognize that women were seen as having a very particular role here. Just as Republican mothers, they had a particular role, a charge to educate young children to be good Republican citizens, particularly their sons, of course. But here, the sociable underpinnings of the Republic relied upon women, because as James Tilton of Delaware put it, men possess the more ostensible powers of making and executing laws, but the women of every free country have an absolute control of manners, and it is confessed that in a republic, manners are of equal importance with laws. And who was in charge of ensuring that manners ran the way they had to run in the Republican court? Much more than George Washington, it was actually Martha Washington. And this is where I think getting at the material culture gives us a clue, because Martha Washington very famously destroyed or had destroyed many of her letters, much of the documentation that would have given us a glimpse into her mind. And I have a quote from one of her surviving letters up later in the lecture that I think actually gives you a hint as to what she was afraid of having revealed beyond her innate sense of privacy. But here you see some things that Martha Washington had as a young woman. You see the young portrait of Martha Washington, so not sort of mob-capped Martha, but in this case, the young, vibrant Martha Dandridge Custis. And on the left, you see the wedding ensemble, a reproduction of the wedding ensemble she wore when she married George. She wore a yellow dress and purple shoes. Now that is a crazy color combination. She also was very fond of garnets, of the red jewelry that you see below. Those were some of her earrings. In other words, she was a fashionista who was not afraid to dress with a whole lot of color and flair. Now she made a conscious decision when Washington was elected president that she was going to, much as he did with his homespun inaugural suit, that she was going to dress to reflect Republican simplicity and ideals. And Washington approved of this, as he wrote, "Her wishes coincide with my own as to simplicity of dress and everything which can tend to support propriety of character without partaking of the follies of luxury and ostentation." And here you see her in a portrait by Edward Savage of the Washingtons and some of the Custis grandchildren, as well as one of the enslaved valets. That is not William Lee. That is the subsequent replacement of William Lee once William Lee's knees made it difficult for him to continue his role as Washington's valet. But here you see Martha Washington in more the familiar guise that we're used to seeing her. So still very fashionable, but a much more subdued self-presentation. And that is on purpose. She touted a neoclassical style in homage to the ideological role models of ancient Greece and Rome. And in doing so, she set the standard. And this was really important. She also set the standard in terms of what she would be called. Much as there was a debate over whether to call Washington any combination of things from Your Highness to Your Excellency to simply Mr. President, debates were had about what to call Martha Washington. During the revolution itself, she was often called Lady Washington, but once Washington was elected president, she eschewed that title. It was suggested that she be called, again, Lady Washington or Marquise Washington, which I wonder if that was meant to be a nod to Lafayette, but she chose to simply be Mrs. Washington, and that was to deliberately set herself off from European models. But the takeaway I want to have here is that in the public mind, she was inextricably linked to George Washington in the 1790s and early 19th century. She was not set apart from Washington in many respects. And I think that this mourning brooch, which was gifted after George Washington died by Martha to its owner, which we'll go over in the primary source documents, really hints at this. Here you see their intertwined hair. They are literally intertwined in this brooch, as they were in life and in the public imagination. Now, of course, every time Martha Washington had to have her hair done or get dressed for a public event, she was not doing this herself. And one of the people who was with her, who was responsible for getting her dressed, for helping her maintain this Republican, non-luxurious, non-ostentatious appearance that was so important to the politics of the day, was her enslaved personal maid, Ona Judge. Ona Judge had been made Martha's personal attendant at Mount Vernon when she was about 10 years old. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman who was part of the dower slaves, the Custis slaves at Mount Vernon, and a free white tailor. She might have gotten her skills from her father because she was described as being handy and useful to Martha Washington, as she was perfect mistress of her needle. And just to give you an idea, throughout the day, what she would have done is she would have dressed Martha Washington. She would have made unguents and lotions and things to soften her skin and her hair, and she would have rubbed her feet when they were tired, and she would have dressed her before bed. And after Martha went to bed, Ona would have stayed up mending her clothes and brushing them down and caring for them, as well as doing sewing work. Now, when Martha and George Washington went to Philadelphia for the presidency, when it was then the capital, as Lindsay told you, they lived in the president's house, which is no longer extant. But here you see a structure that was raised where it used to be within sight of Independence, of the Independence State House. And of course, with them were a number of enslaved people, a mere pittance of the people they held in bondage at Mount Vernon, which registered in the hundreds. And here you see a monument that, when it was proposed 10 years ago, was hotly contested. I think it's important to note. You see their names memorialized here. Now, this was a problem for the Washingtons because under that Gradual Emancipation Act in Pennsylvania of 1780, if enslaved people were in the city longer than 6 months, they could petition for their freedom. George Washington and Martha Washington were made aware of this by the Attorney General of the United States early in the 1790s. And George Washington, and you have it in his own words, decided to cycle them in and out of the city, quote, under pretext that may deceive both them and the public so that they could not be emancipated. Martha Washington was integral to this plan. And here you see one of her very unfortunate statements about Black people. This plan would not have worked without her. She worked equally with Washington to cycle their enslaved people in and out of the city. And some of them, of course, seized their own freedom, among them Ona Judge. And this, I think, is where we get back to the promise of the 1790s for African Americans as well as for women. That sort of like seed of radical possibility embedded within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution for all their faults in terms of granting natural rights to a broad swath of we the people. And that is that the 1790s, Philadelphia in the 1790s was an extraordinarily vibrant site of a dynamic free Black community. And here you see one of its leaders, Richard Allen, a formerly enslaved man who, along with Absalom Jones, was inspired in what I think of as a very early inspiring civil rights activity almost. He was told to leave a pew in the Methodist church at which he was worshiping in the early 1790s and to go sit up in the balcony because the church, like all of these churches in Philadelphia at the time, wanted to segregate whites and Blacks, and Black congregants were to sit up in the balcony, separate from the whites. Richard Allen refused, didn't want to get up during the prayer, and ended up walking out of the church in protest, never went back, and decided instead to found his own church, which is the first independent free Black Protestant church in America. Which still, the descendant of it still stands today at 6th and Lombard, where in the 1790s, Richard Allen bought a blacksmith shop, which you see there being hauled by horses, moved it to 6th and Lombard, renovated it, and it became the first church, which is now a much more grand church called Mother Bethel, the African Methodist Episcopalian Church. And I think that Richard Allen and the fact that he and other free Black people are engaged in this very vibrant, very dynamic, very courageous community in Philadelphia is really important to understanding why Ona Judge self-emancipated from the Washingtons. Because I often like to think about what it must have been like to be Ona Judge, to be living in the house of the most powerful man, indisputably the most powerful man in America, and to decide that you're going to seize your freedom and walk out of that house and never return. And I think that it shows remarkable courage. And I think that the free Black community in Philadelphia must have been inspiring to her. And I think it's very interesting too, to remember that the president's house was one of Robert Morris's property. And Robert Morris himself, during the American Revolution, had an enslaved man called Hero who chose to leave. He didn't want to go out into the countryside with the Morrises when the British occupied Philadelphia. And it took Robert Morris's business partner, Thomas Willing, 6 months to find Hero in the city, even though he was only living 4 blocks away from Willing in an alley, because the already vibrant free Black community of Philadelphia had made it possible for Hero to evade the recapture by one of the most powerful men in Philadelphia. So that the president's house and Robert Morris, it's a multi-generational story of enslaved people self-emancipating that's linked to that of Ona Judge. And we're going to talk about this in the primary source documents, of course, but here is a copy of the advertisement that was placed by the Washingtons in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1796 when she took her freedom. And we'll go over the description here of Ona Judge, which I think is really interesting and tells us a lot about the how enslaved people were envisioned by their slaveholders. And also is a really great reminder that this is but the opening salvo, that the Washingtons were tireless in wanting Ona Judge back. And again, I think it's really critical to recognize that Martha Washington is pivotal to this. This is not just George Washington. And that I think that Ona Judge is a really great reminder of someone who faces incredible odds. The system is very stacked against her. And yet she makes it her own. She takes charge of her life. And she ends up in New Hampshire, has a family, evades the clutches of the Washingtons. Erica Armstrong Dunbar has a wonderful book about this called Never Caught, which also has a child's book version, which I recommend for those of you who are going to teach younger children. And essentially, she's able, like the free Black community in Philadelphia, to create a life against impossible odds. And I think it's important to notice that religion is very critical to her self-identity in New Hampshire, where she settles. And that this is something that is important to many women as well as African Americans in the United States. And I think that we don't discuss religion perhaps as much as we could when we talk about politics, particularly in America. But I think it's important to realize that religion is sort of underpinning a lot of American society, a lot of decisions that people are making, and that this is a really interesting snapshot into how that applies for women as well as men, for Black Americans as well as white. So to conclude, I want to briefly look at that other question that I asked at the beginning of the lecture, which is, why is it that women like Elizabeth Willing Powell get written out of the founding story, out of the collective story that most Americans choose to remember about the founding? Not necessarily the textbooks or historians' monographs, but just your average American. If you stopped your average American on the street and asked them about the Republic, if you can keep its story, most people would have heard of it, but most people would get it wrong. I mean, Nancy Pelosi got it wrong. But why is that? Why do we leave women out of the story of the founding era? Why do we leave people like Richard Allen out of our story? Could he not be seen as a founding father in a sense, in terms of what he did for the Black community in Philadelphia for generations? Because as I mentioned, Mother Bethel still stands. And part of that, I think, is because women have not been sort of allowed, and Black Americans have not been really often given a central role in telling the stories of founding era. And this started really early on. Mercy Otis Warren, famous to you from the Revolution, and her work as a staunch patriot who wrote anonymous plays and poems, many of them at the encouragement of her friend John Adams, wrote a foundational 3-volume work called History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution that was published in 1805. Now, she took copious notes throughout the Revolution, and I will just tell you, Volume 1, I think, only gets you to 1775, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's a lot of there. It's also very partisan. Warren was an unabashed anti-federalist. She thought the Constitution way overstepped in terms of its centralization of power. And she had not very flattering things to say about her friend John Adams. She also, Thomas Jefferson ordered copies for himself and his cabinet. So that tells you something, given the dynamics between Jefferson and Adams. And Adams was irate. They exchanged some really incendiary letters that are entertaining and sad simultaneously. And he went so far as to write to a friend that, as he put it, history is not the province of the ladies. Now, they ended up making up, and that is evidenced in yet more hair jewelry. This stuff was wildly popular. And here I think you see, again, Mercy Otis Warren is being more generous than John Adams. If you look at the brooch on the right, that is her hair. She gave a lot more hair than John and Abigail gave, which is in the ring that was gifted to her up above a few strands of their hair. And these were sort of like friendship hair jewelry, right? They were meant to, they were given in 1812, exchanged in 1812, meant to show that the rift caused by her publication of the History of the American Revolution in 1805 had healed. And I'd like to suggest that this is perhaps a hopeful metaphor for the fact that, that there is this unfulfilled promise that lies within the founding era for the parts of we the people who are not perhaps specified or given rights outright in the Declaration or the Constitution, and to think of, though, also why it is that this story of women and Black Americans being left out of our standard stories of the founding era resonates so much with us today and remains still such a fact, despite all of the promises that have been fulfilled. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and that I look forward to your questions.